Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Carr, and I'm coordinator for the Coastal Marine Ecosystem-Based Management Tools Network, or EBM Tools Network, which is co-coordinated by Octo and NatureServe. And also co-moderating today, we have Ray Everard, who is a program manager with Octo. And we're very happy to have John McManus from the Rosenstiel School of the University of Miami on today to talk on massively destructive coral reef damage from giant clam shell digging in the South China Sea, the birth, death, and rebirth of this industry, although we wish we were talking about something happier today. So I want to let you know, before we turn it over to John to get started, I want to let you guys know how to ask questions. So John's going to present, and then we should have a good amount of time for questions afterwards. There are two ways to ask questions. You can type the questions into the chat panel, or you could type them into the question and answer interface. Either of those work. With the chat panel, you have the option of making it visible to everyone. So if you had some pertinent information you wanted to provide to everyone, or web links, you can do that through the chat, or you could send the question just to the panelists, and the Q&A just goes straight to the panelists. So anyway, we encourage you can go ahead and send in questions at any point. Okay, John, we'll turn it over to you now.
Sorry, I had to run and get a clock so I know what time it was. All right, so are we live?
We are, yep.
Okay, so I'm gonna zip through a bunch of slides. I encourage people to ask questions about anything to do with this, because I try to keep track of all aspects of the situation. I'm not an expert on all of them, but we have actually probably online a number of experts, and they're welcome to correct me as we get to the question and answer part. The reason I wanted to do this was because we've got news of a restart of this problem of giant clam digging. So let me tell you more about the situation. Just in general, it's important to keep in mind that the highest biodiversity in the world for marine organisms is this area, sometimes called the Coral Triangle. And the reason the Coral Triangle doesn't extend into the South China Sea is because there wasn't enough information. But more recently, we do know that there's 571 species of coral, as opposed to 600 total. So it really should be part of the Coral Triangle. And by contrast, there's about 70 genera of coral here, and about 70 species of coral in the Caribbean, and likewise, more or less true also for Hawaii. So this is enormously higher biodiversity than most of the rest of the world. It's also important because there's 15% of the total global catch coming out of this little sea. And sorry.
Just keeping you safe, John.
Yes, I know. Some of those emails that came in, so it'll take care of it. Now it's gone. Okay. All right. So 15% of the global catch, 21.8 of the $1 billion a year landed, 45% due to China fishing, 3.7 million people employed in fishing, and it's more than 500,000 in China alone, and 38 million impoverished people living around the South China Sea coastline. And fishing is really important, not as much as people say for protein, but rather because they supply income for millions of people and keep those villages going. And for the link to the coral reefs is, there's many links to the coral reefs of the overall fishing, but it's important that tuna and mackerel often feed on reef fish. And I've often been on reefs in the region and seen tuna or schools of mackerel come up. The mackerel will come up in hundreds of them, and they'll open up their mouths all at once with a big whoosh, and they'll scoop up all of this food and move on. So when you talk about the coral reefs, they're part of a major problem, a major issue with overfishing in the South China Sea. There's also a lot of confusion. People say, oh, well, there's all of this oil, so we can't, for instance, put in international peace parks because that might inhibit the drilling of oil. But the fact is that, and this is from the Energy Information Agency of the US, but also here a graphic from the CSIS I'll talk about later. But you can see that there's not really a lot of oil here. And one of the reasons is that coral reefs act as chimneys. They're full of holes. So any hydrocarbons that collect shifted away. So yes, there's a lot of oil, 10 times as much as likely as there is around the coral reefs. And the shipping through here is quite important. And you can see that this is just as an example of the kind of shipping that's going through. This is just the oil shipping, but this is a major place. So one of the, this is $5+ trillion a year in shipping, 80% of the trade to China, 60% of the oil and gas getting to Japan and Taiwan, and 40% of the world's shipping goes through here. And so the practice is if there's any shooting going on, then the shipping will stop. So it's not like you have to blockade it. I mean, it's just the ships are under agreement to not go through dangerous areas. So we have to keep the place peaceful, which is always an issue with South China Sea. Now, these are the reef areas, and what these are is little circles denoting where I've identified on satellite imagery that the reefs are breaking through. So these are the reefs that are actually at the surface. These are the ones that are vulnerable, in particular to things like the clam digging. And the key ones here, Dongsha Atoll, which is maintained by Taiwan, but China claims that the Paracel Islands, which China occupied, sort of moving out the Vietnamese in 1974, Scarborough Atoll, which is the one I'm going to focus on, and the Spratly Islands, which are down here. And all of this, basically they call it the 9-dash line. China claims all of this area. It comes to within 22 nautical miles of the Malaysian coastline at the southern point here, cuts into, this is Indonesia, cuts into Indonesian territory and so forth. So there's also overlapping claims for everybody here, and that makes it very complicated. But Scarborough Atoll is basically only seriously claimed by China and the Philippines. So that's sort of the low apple here. When you have overfishing, you start fishing, you catch more and more fish. After a while, you've got so many people fishing that you get a decline in what you catch. But any place over from just near the maximum sustainable yield point here to the right is collapse. And those people who remember what happened with the cod industry understand what that means. You just go down to practically uneconomical levels, leaving thousands of people with no income. We think this is already happening in the South China Sea, but we're talking about hundreds of commercial species and not much data. One reason there's not much data is because it's dangerous to go in there. And in fact, yesterday we found out about an incident in which apparently a Chinese fishing vessel hit a Philippine fishing vessel and then took off, leaving 22 fishers in the water to be rescued by a Vietnamese fishing boat. And this was very close to the Philippine coastline. So to give you some idea of what sorts of things we're watching here. wonderful little graphic that was made for my talks by NASA a couple of years ago. And it's an annual run. And anyone familiar with the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico circulation, it's relatively predictable compared to this. This is about as predictable as if you were looking down in an upright clothes washer that's going back and forth, and all of the little whirls of water spinning in all directions. So it's very, very, very well mixed, much better mixed than most of the other similar sized water bodies in the world. The coral reefs are in mostly atolls. These are, we're talking about the ones offshore, are mostly atolls, platform reefs, or similar structures. But here you can see this ghostly structure here. The way atolls are formed is they, at least these offshore ones, are formed by a sinking mountain. And in this case, there was a sinking ridge, and it formed this big coral reef, and it kept sinking, and it sank too fast, or water rose. It's relative sinking. Water rose too fast, and the portions that were able to keep up with it became atolls and platform reefs of their own. And so typically on these things, you'll see, in this case, Chinese base. There's several Vietnamese bases, some more Chinese bases. So you'll see multiple countries on any one of these things, and there's several of these things, as well as some atolls that are just isolated. This one here is the first one that actually had shooting. About 60 Vietnamese defenders were killed in a conflict with China that was sparked actually by China's agreement to be the local scientists doing the monitoring for the International Oceanographic Commission. And that's what actually sparked the violence. These areas between here, I've always thought there might be a lot of coral here, and you can see one blown up here, which is from the northern tip of this. And you can see these spurs and groove structures. And we have recently, I was honored to accompany a Taiwanese trip to their island here. And right about here, we saw a wonderful coral. So I suspect that the coral isn't too bad. 2/3 of the reef area in these offshore parts of the Spratlys is subsurface that goes 30 to 60 feet at the shallowest between these surface structures. This is the one I want to focus on. This is Scarborough. It's way off to one side, and it's a beautiful reef. This is what we have with coral reef structures. People, especially trained in Florida, are often confused. They'll think, oh, this is a coral reef. That's a patch of coral on a large structure here, which has seagrass beds and other coral patches and sometimes algae beds. And here's the reef crest. And we now know that somewhere around 97% of wave energy is taken out by this kind of structure. So where you see the damage from the giant clam harvesting, as well as the building of military outposts, it's this area right up to the crest and back along this reef flat before you get into the deeper part of the lagoon. And where it's actually built onto the crest, that's pretty much doomed, because the reef crest has to keep up with little changes in sea level in order to protect whatever you build back here. And we know that there's a lot of dispersion. You know, you saw the currents going all over the place. This is just one of several published analyses of what happens if you're a larval fish here. How far can you go within a month, which is about the average for reef fish being in the plankton. But in other studies, we've seen them going up further. And furthermore, they didn't do any drops over here, which is where Scarborough Reef is. So Spratlys is obviously interchanging with Scarborough Reef, but Scarborough Reef is an area where the currents go north. So Scarborough Reef is particularly important, we believe, to China and Taiwan, and we need better studies of that connectivity. This is a town in China going fishing. This one is actually going towards the East China Sea, but we have similar problem in the cities which supply the fishing for the South China Sea. And you see, these are all very nice boats. A lot of them are subsidized by the government. They actually have a militia that's based on fishing boats, some of which may or may not be fishing, but they're certainly watching the place, and they come with these buttons like, push this button and we'll show up with our missile destroyers if anything happens to you. This is one of the larger Philippine boats. This is a bangka with outriggers, and it's got little boats on top. And I had thought before I went in there again in 2016 that the reef flats must be fairly well protected, because even a boat like this can't really make it onto the reef flat. But they have it, they have all these little boats, and they drop them off, and these little boats go in and they go fishing. And I actually used one as a safety boat at one point, and that was before it hit me in the head. And you see there's all kinds of gear, and they put several different kinds of gear on these things, cast net, spear gun, and so forth, so that they can catch whatever they see. Now these are bigger bankas. They're smaller than this total one here, but these are standard banka sizes. And this picture was grabbed from Google Earth right in the middle of the South China Sea. It's the very northern part of the Spratly Islands. He's pulling 12 of these. These things are generally found more than 97% of the time, based on a study we did during our 7-year monitoring program in the Philippines. These are found within 1 kilometer of shore or a reef crest, and yet they're being towed way out here. We know that people are actually being killed, again, because Vietnam has advertised that it's rescued a couple of people from one of the boats in one of these strings, and you worry about what happens to everybody else. But news is not easy to get. We don't have a lot of, say, fisher mortality figures to work with. So we can just surmise that people are literally dying to go fishing. And by the way, the waves out there can get really big, as I can attest to, having been out there a few times recently, as well as in the late 80s, early 90s. Now, this was a big mystery. This picture down here, somebody in the military contacted me and says, what's happening? And I says, I don't know, but whatever it is, this is terrible. When you see silt and sand sliding all over a coral reef, the silt and sand are made by organisms, and under a microscope you can see all these little structures, little sharp edges, you know, for especially if they're made from calcareous algae and so forth. But whatever they are, they always stick to your wetsuit. They stick to anything, and they stick similarly to any kind of mucous membrane. So most organisms, animal organisms, have some kind of mucus gill structure, and it will just kill it. You know, so when you'll see that I actually did a survey across here, and it was devastating. And this picture on the right is one of the pictures that I took from right about here. And so it was a big mystery what these were. You zoom in, there's these arcs. The thing normally causes arcs is dredgers. Whereas people say, oh, giant clamming. Well, giant clam usually means you're on a boat, you see a giant clam, you jump over and you grab it. So all of this was a great mystery as to what was going on for 3 or 4 years. Now, the Philippine military actually knew what was going on as of at least 2012, and maybe earlier, and they'd been in touch with other intelligence agencies. This wasn't being, sort of made public. And so for those of us on the outside of all of this, it was a great mystery, and we were trying to figure out what was going on. And then Victor Robert Lee, who is A, novelist, and B, he buys imagery and analyzes it. And so he lives a double life, and he found this picture on a Chinese website, and it shows a boat spinning its motor, causing one of these plumes. But that didn't in itself explain the arc. However, here you see somebody pulling the boat. And then I followed up this picture and found out also on Chinese website, anonymous poster, they saw all of these boats here, and these are arcs. Now, these pictures from the Pratas Islands, which is closer to China, but you can see the arcs and all of these boats. And what's happening is they anchor the boat. They have a specially reinforced propeller, and they spin the propeller and pull the boat back and forth. And there's various variations of this. Again, I didn't believe that anyone would be crazy enough to use their boat propeller to dig up hard coral substrate, but then I got to see one of the confiscated propellers when I went to the Philippine base in the South China Sea. So this is that base here. This is the main Philippine base. It's called Pag-asa to Filipinos, and that means hope. And you can see I did swimming transect here. Then we went up here. I was with a film crew, and they wanted to take footage. And I looked at this place. This was very confusing because I actually saw a substrate that was thousands of years old that had never been exposed. And what had happened was the giant clamfishers had dug up the sediment, put them in their arcs, and then the currents on this arrow-shaped reef had washed it away. And so this whole place had virtually no sand at all. And then out here in the deeper portions, we saw the sand had killed lots and lots of coral. And here was this reef. I call this checkmark reef, the name. This is Teishi Reef, but checkmark reef. I did this transect here. It was my last transect. And I swam for more than 2 kilometers before I saw a single living invertebrate. It was the worst I'd ever seen on any reef. And usually I only get to see reefs that are very beat up, but this was the worst I'd ever seen. It was really a shock. So that confirmed that the giant clam fishers were doing this after Victor Robert Lee had already published and said that must be what's going on. And yes, he was right. So this is a picture from the reef flat of Pag-asa Island that's more or less protected from at least the Chinese boats from the Philippines. And it looks really nice, but actually it could look much nicer. These are all a particular species that actually eats microorganisms, so it can survive anywhere. And you can see there's chunks of blue-green algae. And there's actually a lot of seagrass in this area, but it turns out that the seagrass had grown after people had moved in. There's a village there. So this is a fairly, typical reef flat near a village. And then this is what I saw at Checkmark Reef. And this is what happened to it. Now, the thing is, it's quite important, this will recover. If they hadn't torn up the substrate, it would recover within generally 4 to 10 years because there's a typhoon area. Those corals don't take that long to grow. And these over here, and these, you'll get the scouring of the surface, and then out of all of these little crevices, tissue will reemerge and it will resheet it. But here we've got this terrible disruption of substrate, but it's still going to happen. It just may take another decade. So within 20 years, we could see recovery if this had stopped, if the practice had stopped. This is what they're after, these giant clam shells. A single pair of these can go for $1,000. Even one really nice one can go for $1,000 for the giant clam hunters from Tanmen, Hainan. They're making all kinds of beautiful things out of this sort of ivory substitute. And there are even sculptures that are just too appealing. I didn't actually put the really nice ones here because I don't want to encourage people to buy these things. Now we got news. Just yesterday, I found this article. It was published in June 3rd, Sixth Tone. This is a non-governmental news outlet in China, and they have some wonderful articles. But this one written by Zhao Xinying, who's an environmental reporter. She had links to government documents, one of which showed that the average income annually at the height of the practice was 160 million yuan, which is more than $23 million a year. So the earlier estimates that some of us were putting out of $1 billion a year were probably too high. Even if you account for other parts of the trading chain, probably tens of millions is a safer estimate, which is good. That means that there's less pressure to do this than we actually thought. But still, it's remarkable that China was actually able to shut down this industry at $23 million a year with the signing of a document. Very few countries is that possible. I doubt it would go over that easily within the US. You'd have some kind of compromise. So the ban as of 2017, January 2017, so it stopped at the end of 2016, was on gathering giant clams via blasting, drilling, application of toxic substances, and electric shock. I have no idea why anyone would try to catch, dig up dead giant clams from electric shock, but nonetheless, that's what the code says. Notice it does not include anything about water pumping. So later. Now, this on the left is a healthy coral reef. This picture is from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, and Digital Globe. And you can see all of these wonderful ecosystems here. And at the time, this had a little Chinese base, which was on stilts. I was quite happy when everything just stayed on stilts. But then you see there's this time where you get all of these arcs, and there's even some plumes here, so there's active digging here. And that killed everything here. And then China, when they're talking about the military bases, this is the early structure of one. This is 2-kilometer runway ultimately here. The documentation they put out, because under law of the sea, you have to put out an environmental impact statement. And so they put out this short little thing of a few pages, and they said, well, our scientists went in the water and all the coral was dead. So then it's okay. We built on dead coral. And that's why I emphasize that this coral would have recovered. So basically you had a sick patient and buried it alive. There is nothing you can do once you get to this stage to recover this. It's just completely impossible. You want to dig it up, take away the concrete they finally put in and all that stuff. It's going to cause even more problems. So this is permanent, and this would have been 20 years recovery. And I found this on every single one of the 7 Chinese artificial islands. There had been previously giant clam digging. And just to show you what's happened, this is a beautiful reef. I saw this sometime around 1990, and it was beautiful. I mean, I was underwater and it went dark, and I was watching what the fish did when it was dark, and I thought that was an eclipse or a big cloud. And my dive buddy who stayed up above me because of a sinus problem, when I came up, he says, "Did you see that huge school of hammerhead sharks that went right over your head?" So this was a very healthy system with lots of predators. And you see here, there was actually early on a Chinese military outpost. And this is quite close to the Philippines as well. But let me show you what it looks like now. So you see, it's completely gone. And in the process, you can see the massive, well, not here, but in other images, you can see massive plumes of sediment here. So basically everything died in here. You could even see where they had fish cages that they had to remove because, you know, all the fish would have been killed. So this is what's happened, and this is huge. This is more than a kilometer runway here. Scarborough Reef. This is the one I want to focus in particular because recently there's been a revival of the damage. Now, I went here again right around 1990 in a separate trip, and these big, long structures here were mostly a beautiful purple form of organ pipe coral. So when you're swimming through them, it's like you're walking through some really world-class gardens. And this is fairly close to Luzon, the Philippines. And so the tourist value would have been very high. And it had these unfortunate, these structures unfortunately look like submarines and ships. And the U.S. military before the Iran invasion was using them for bombing practice, as apparently some of the Philippines were. And so there was a lot of unexploded munitions here when I went there around 1990, but most of that's been cleared out. And this is an important rock. It's actually a Pratas head. There's several of them across the region, and there's some great scientists from China who've been trying to figure out where did they come from. And initially they were thinking it was typhoons, but it's been proposed that maybe there were one or more tsunamis that actually made these things pop up. But whatever it is, this is actually legally an island. It's just not an exclusive economic zone continental shelf island. And you can see the same rock here with a Philippine flag and a Chinese flag, just to emphasize what we're dealing with here. In 2012, there was a showdown between the Philippine vessels and Chinese vessels, and a storm was coming up, so they both left, and China turned around and came back, and has been guarding the place ever since, but allowing some fishers from the Philippines to come up occasionally, although last month there was an incident where they stole the catch, so there's that kind of problem. This is, again, the reef crest here, the reef flat, and you see these arcs. These are from the giant clam fishing. So this had been going on for quite a while. In fact, Huangyan, which is what they call Scarborough Reef, the sea ivory from Huangyan is supposed to be the best in the world. So there's a lot of pressure to work on this place. So in 2016, there was, the ban was coming up, and the Philippine military sent out these images, and you can see the position of various civilian and military boats. This is Chinese Coast Guard. I've been chased by those. They're kind of intimidating when you're in a little fishing boat. And these are their fishing boats, but you can see these racks here. These racks are the ones that are used to carry small boats, which would normally go out across the reef flat and start digging up giant clams. But we couldn't find very many. You can see some here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 happen to be here, but this whole rack on top is empty. And the trouble with satellite imagery, even with CSIS, they have access to everything, but there's not always what you need. And so we couldn't identify the damage at that time. But then I got other reports that it was continuing. Occasionally, particularly at Scarborough Reef, and now in the last month or so, what's happened is the ABS-CBN network, a reporter went out there on one of the bangkas from the Philippines, and they have a wonderful YouTube video that shows the revival of all of this. So the fishers were complaining that this was happening again, and ABS-CBN went out there and very bravely, because the Coast Guard of China was watching it. And when I say Coast Guard of China, basically to emphasize that the whole South China Sea is internal waters to China, China painted a lot of their military vessels white and made new vessels that are white so that they would be called Coast Guard. But we're really talking about missile destroyers and, you know, one of the world's largest naval fleets. So it's quite intimidating, and this group with the reporters went right on through here, and they've got wonderful footage of what's going on. I won't put it here because you should be looking at their video. So CSIS immediately started looking at what was going on, or I guess they'd been doing this for a while, and this is mostly Greg Pauling, and it's an image from 2018 showing the scarring and the work from these little boats. Over here, the brown ones here, those are the motherships, I think. And here they've made a difference image from 2018 to March 2019 showing new scarring. So scarring is continuing, but something else that we learned from the ABS-CBN video was that the fishers had been seeing the Chinese giant clam hunters with pumps and tubes on their boats. And so we studied this, Greg and I on the phone, flipping through the video, and we noticed that they could actually pump water through these things. And I had seen this sort of thing with treasure hunting and archaeological digs. So what they're doing is they're pumping water through these tubes into the bottom to dig up the giant clams. Now, here you can see actually this is a Chinese military vessel turning around to come and harass a Philippine bonka that's trying to escape. Let me just flip back to where I showed you that news here. So the ban said they're banning giant clam harvesting from using blasting, drilling, application of toxic substances, electric shocks. It does not include water pumping. And I kind of suspected this because I know what clever fishers will do. They get around regulations. So there is actually, this is the propeller chopping going on, but they're also using this pumping technique. Greg Pauling has a video online and an interview from a week or so ago with ABS-CBN, and he talks about this in some depth. So these are my original estimates for damage from my 2016-2017 paper published in 2017. And I did this all based on Google Earth because I have no money. So that's cleverly done so everybody can check my results without having any money. But at the time, and these figures actually came from CSIS because the island building was going too fast for me to keep up with. So about 15 square kilometers due to island building and reinforcement and materials dredging, 40 square kilometers, but that's only where we could see it because the ships are digging at 6 meters or more sometimes, and they're grinding up the coral reef and creating structure, and we can't see it so much, so I can't really quantify it. Channel and harbor dredging, and this is permanent. This is permanent. The materials dredging is semi-permanent. But the giant clam chopper damage is 104 square kilometers. Every square kilometer is 1 million square meters. So this is huge. This is 104 square kilometers, 104 million square meters damage from the giant clam boats. Again, if it's stopped, it will recover, whereas this 15 million square meters will never recover. So just something about features above high tides here. This is the biggest island at Scarborough Reef. So entitled to a territorial sea of 12 nautical miles because of that. And there's a bunch of these. There's at least 5 that appear above high tide marks. This is a little sand key, and these actually move around quite a bit. And you can see also the giant clam damage, hunting damage here next to a Chinese military base. This is the second largest island. It's about 1 square kilometer. It's the Philippine base, and this runway was built in the 70s. It's falling apart. And when I flew in and took a boat back. And when we flew in, we had pilots who knew where the potholes were so they could avoid them. And the Philippines had been reluctant to improve this because of the agreements to not expand military in the area. And this is one of the Chinese bases. This is one of the smaller ones, but it shows you how they're built. They pile up some sand, they build a wall around it, pile up some more sand. You can see the sand leaking here and damaging the reef crest, which is a terrible thing to do for these structures. And the reason we emphasize how these are made is because there was information coming up from China that we're just replicating the natural process. Well, this is nothing like the natural process of making islands on coral reefs. I say it's more like akin to how you build a sandbox in your backyard. So they have no legal standing other than a 500-meter safety zone. So these are artificial reefs, and they only get 500 meters around them just to protect them from getting hit by a boat. They do not have any other legal entitlements, despite what people say. And you'll find that Japan is trying to do something similar and make a new island. So here's the islands, the reefs that I showed before. And this is a close-up of just the Spratly ones. These are the military bases. There are about 69 or 70 military outposts across the South China Sea. So only truly crazy people, expert fishers or scientists that are just crazy, and I say I'm living proof. So I've taken the records we could find of existing high tide features, and we can't verify them. The Permanent Court of Arbitration's Tribunal a few years ago did talk about some, and they did identify some as being high tide features. In other words, rocks. Nothing qualifies as an island. An island has to have human habitation and economic life of its own. And so even the Philippine one, which has an actual village on it, it has to be subsidized. So the Philippines knew that it wasn't possible to live on these islands without heavy subsidy, and therefore they cannot have exclusive economic zones. What's more, if you have a high tide feature and you're in an exclusive economic zone, that does not entitle the owner of the exclusive economic zone to own the high tide feature. So these ones without the circles, and these circles are 12 nautical miles, the ones without the circles, like these from the Philippines, are part of the Philippine shelf, and that included that beautiful mischief reef that was like a wedding ring, okay? And that's over here somewhere. That was a piece of the Philippine continental shelf under the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, which all of the claimant countries have ratified, unlike the US. We've got to get our act together. So it's a huge difference if you have one of these high tide features, but we can't even verify where they are. Wherever they are, these things belong to the high tide feature, and the high tide feature is owned in terms of sovereignty law, not law of the sea. So all of these are going to be in doubt. Also under law of the sea, you can compel arbitration, but in sovereignty, that's much more difficult to do. So people that generally have to agree to sit down and say, who owns this under an arbitration? And that's not likely to happen. So deciding who owns these things is going to be extremely difficult. But these circles without any evidence of high tide feature are definitely just part of the continental shelf entitled under the law of the sea. So China does have international resource agreements. People keep saying, oh no, China never does this. Well, they do. As of 2007, they had 17 transboundary protected area agreements on land, one of them which included 4 countries, China, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Russia. And they're members of 12 regional fisheries bodies, which, you know, that's multilateral discussions and negotiations. And China is a partner with Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin Fishery Cooperative Agreement. And there's a related maritime boundary delineation there. So people say, oh, China would never do this. Well, they have a history of doing this. The law of the sea, in UNCLOS here, Article 123, says that states that border enclosed or semi-enclosed seas will cooperate, should cooperate with each other in exercising their rights, coordinate the management, conservation, exploration, exploitation of the living resources, coordinate the protection and preservation of the marine environment, coordinate their scientific research, and invite, as appropriate, other interested states or international organizations to cooperate with them. Now, this is in the law of the sea, and this is because we have this similar problem in general in any enclosed or enclosed basin where you have multiple nations around them. Then there's always this problem that the fish are shared. Fish don't follow the boundaries. So this was known in the formulation of the law of the sea. So let me talk a little about peace parks here just for a few minutes. I see I'm getting over time. Peace park is set up to protect areas where you have disagreements basically on the boundaries. And one way you can do this in these cases is following the provisions of the Antarctic Treaty, which actually had overlapping claims. And the key thing is on claims and the freeze on claims supportive activities. So the treaty is renewed every 30 years. And when you sign it, you're saying, I'm not going to change my claim, and I'm not going to allow anything I do in the next 30 years to have anything in support of my claim. And so that takes away all of the game playing, which includes deadly games like ramming boats. So locally, there is a Malaysia, Philippines, Turtle Islands Peace Park, which is very successful. And so there's already a local model as well as the traditional model of the Israel-Jordan Peace Park. So the trouble with the Spratly one is it's going to be multilateral, but we have to keep pushing it. All of these countries have people in favor of this. And the idea now is to make it more appealing to China. But Scarborough Atoll is just China, Philippines. So if we just focus a bit on that peace park, maybe we can get through some of these problems. And a park does not mean a no fishing zone. This is a piece of the Great Barrier Marine Park, and all of these different colors have different management schemes. You can go fishing in the Great Barrier Marine Park. It's not banned, it just means certain areas you can fish. And the same thing with the Florida Keys National Marine Park and Papahānaumokuākea in Hawaii. They have zones where you can and can't do. So what do we need? We need to freeze on claim supportive activities, in particular the Regional Environmental and Fisheries Organization, which there isn't for this area. It falls under a West Pacific thing, which is just too broad. We'd like to see, at least for each military base, that they stop all fishing within 1 nautical mile of the outpost. And the military generally like to keep fishers away. So maybe that would help. And that'll give you about 1,000 square kilometers of protected area. Joint research cruises with claimant countries represented, that's perfectly possible now. There are some good research vessels, and Scarborough and Spratly Islands Peace Parks. So I'm just going to put this up, the acknowledgements. I have had no funding for 10 years for anything. So I've cleverly avoided representing anyone in this talk. But the Humanitarian Dialogue Foundation is the first foundation to seriously get involved in this stuff, and they have started setting up workshops just in the last year. The ADM Capital Foundation funded a study of the South China Sea and brought me in somewhere for a meeting, and the Asia Foundation has brought me into meetings. So all of these organizations, CSIS in Washington, governments of Vietnam, Taiwan, USA, Belgium, they all have brought me into various places. No one wants to pay for it, but they don't mind paying my ticket. This is just thanking Greg Pauling and others at CSIS and Victor Robert Lee, who convinced me that the damage was from giant clams and not dredging. And I'll leave this up just for a second for further information, and this will be on YouTube, Vimeo, and Open Channel, so people will be able to freeze the video and get to some of these references. And just this last section talking about me, and I can take any questions.
Okay, thank you, John. I wish it were a happier topic we were talking about. Okay, we do have some questions. I'd start with, do marine biologists in China know about all this, and are they speaking out about it at all? Absolutely.
That ban seems to have come from a combination of good coral reef scientists in the southern China area, as well as conservationists, and they, as you can see, they have environmental reporters as well. They even have a new head of environment a couple of years now, who is really trying to clean up the air and the water systems, and you'll see all kinds of efforts to plant corals. A lot of it, though, is based on misinformation as to what you can do and what kind of sizes of areas. And you never want the ability to plant corals to override the fact that you should be protecting and stopping the damage. But nonetheless, yes, they have good scientists there. They can't out freely as we can in the US, but they certainly have scientific publications in favor of the Peace Park and in favor of protection.
Okay, and also, what are NGOs doing, like Greenpeace and WWF and other environmental NGOs doing about this? Are they sort of ignoring the damage, or are they speaking out?
Yeah, well, I consider what's going on a self-assembling system. The big NGOs generally have operations in China that they cannot jeopardize. I have heard that WWF was going to try to do community work in Tanmen, which is the home of a lot of this, the giant clam fishing, which is wonderful. I hope they get going on that. But they couldn't openly talk about this thing because of that. And that's all of the big NGOs. And I even saw a Sea Shepherd thing, and I'm a huge fan of what Sea Shepherd does, but they were carefully following a boat that had been illegally fishing in Antarctica through the South China Sea, and not trying to take on perhaps the second largest military navy in the world. So it's been a problem, and that's why I'm very happy that the ADM Capital Foundation is beginning to invest in this just in the last few years. And just in the last year, really, the Humanitarian Dialogue Foundation of Switzerland has started to organize these meetings. And this is a major breakthrough. And they're organizing with the cooperation of China. And that's what we've been waiting for.
Okay, thanks, John. A question, do the coral reefs in the South China Sea replenish the Pacific? Or presumably, yeah, corals in the Pacific.
We think so. Mind you, you can't just hop in a research vessel and go out here. You don't even know who to ask for permission. And law of the sea kind of demonizes scientists a bit by requiring that you get permission from somebody. So doing research doesn't enforce a claim, but when you ask permission to do research, that gets into a claim. And everybody's afraid of getting rammed. After I did my 2016 trip to Pagasa, the Philippine researchers did run a ship up there to their base, and it was the first time since 2012 that they, no, actually, since 1999, I think, that they'd actually been able to go to their own village up there to do research. So we don't know much what's going on, but the currents would indicate that yes, there is flushing that's going out, and particularly Scarborough, which is along the Luzon coastline, where the currents go north. Occasionally they're being flushed into the Pacific, and so that could be important. However, there aren't a lot of reefs below Taiwan in that open area, except Okinatorishima, which is the Japanese one, which is pretty far away. So it's more about hitting the southern Taiwanese reefs and perhaps some of the southernmost Japanese reefs.
Okay, thank you, John. We got a message from Antonio Clapperals, who's president of the Ecological Society of the Philippines, and he's saying that they're going to be putting forward a marine peace park proposal next year in IUCN. Are you familiar with that? Are you in touch with Antonio?
Oh yeah, hi Tony.
Okay, all right.
Thanks for getting on board.
Okay.
Yes, no, I've been working with them for decades, as of the time I was in the Peace Corps in the Philippines in the late 70s.
Okay, so one final question is, what can other scientists around the world and the people here, what can we usefully do?
Well, the main reason I wanted to give this talk right away was because of this renewal of the activity. And one of the strongest things that people can do is talk about. The world has to know this is going on. It was so secretive for years, we couldn't do anything about it, couldn't talk about it. And now we're getting some information, particularly thanks to the Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS, but from the brave environmental reporters from the Philippines and so forth. So now we've got the information there. Now, China controls the information that gets to its citizens to a large degree. However, scientists do have to go online and get information, and there are 800,000 Chinese students around the world. And so by getting this stuff into the press, then the information can't help but get back into China. And as somebody was asking before, is there strong environmental groups? Yes, there's very strong environmental movements in China, and they have to just know what's going on. So that's the thing to do, really to talk it up, get it in the news, and then we can try our best to get the information filtered into China, where citizen action and government action can take place. Okay.
Well, thank you, John, so much for speaking with us about it today. And when you have an update, we can see about doing another webinar and targeting it at some other time zones. But we want to stay abreast of this and do what we can to help. Okay, and thank you everyone who's attended. We're very glad you could be here today. And John, did you want to say anything?
Oh, I'm just thrilled that so many people decided to tune in, and I'm very happy if anybody is able to watch this on YouTube and Vimeo and Open Channel. And just please just talk about it openly, get the word out, and we'll get the world to stop ignoring the problem, and then the problems will subside.
Okay. Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone. And you should all receive a link after this, an automated email, which will have a link to where you can find the recording. So please pass on the recording to other colleagues and people who might be interested. Okay, and thank you again, John, for doing this.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye, everyone.